Hi, everyone. My name is Greg Coladonato. I'm your host tonight. Welcome to Google. If this is the first time you've come to Google, thank you for coming to hear this event tonight. Don't mind the dinosaur out in the front yard or the spaceship hanging over the stairway. They're just props. They're not, neither one's real, actually. So thank you very much for coming tonight. The SD Forum Ruby SIG is held here for a while it was every month, and now we're probably going to switch over to every other month. This is our March event. Next month we have hopefully you saw the handouts. There's a Ruby conference that that SD Forum is doing, and I hope you can all come. I went last year, and it was a great time, a great weekend. So tonight we have a couple guys from a startup that's just started late last year, correct? I read about them first on a tech blog called TechCrunch, which if you're interested in startups, I would recommend you check that out as well. And these guys were interested in coming speaking a little bit about how they use Rails in their production environment and some of the things they've bumped into. So with no further ado, welcome, Kris and Andy, and thanks for coming.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for coming out. We appreciate you taking your time to listen to us speak. I'm Andrew Holt. This is Kris Rasmussen. We're the founders of a company called RivalSoft and the creators of Competitious. So we're here to talk a little bit about our experience with Ruby on Rails as a startup. We'll start off by telling you a little bit about ourselves and give you a quick background, and also give you a demo of Competitious for those of you that haven't had a chance to see it yet. We'll talk a little bit about why we chose Ruby on Rails and the decision process we went through in choosing. There's a lot of languages and frameworks to consider, and why we went with Ruby on Rails. We'll quickly cover some of the pros and cons that we've encountered using Ruby. And then kind of the bulk of the presentation, we'll go through some of our code and some of the interesting things we've done to solve some of the problems we've encountered along the way. So my background, I have a BS in computer science from Stanford. Right out of Stanford, I went to work for Yahoo in the merchant services section of Yahoo Shopping. I worked to integrate the larger clients, all the big people, into Yahoo Shopping. We moved over to a CPC model, and I became a project manager and worked on the self-serve platform for smaller merchants to become integrated into the shopping platform. I left Yahoo after 2 years, got a little tired of working there, and co-founded a company called Reviewinity. We built a product comparison engine to help consumers find the best product for them, taking an algorithmic approach, basically aggregating user reviews in a way that no one had really done before. And then we also provided the technology for online communities like forums to help members share product opinions between themselves, and that was all in PHP. I did that for about a year and a half, then we moved on, worked on some interim ideas, and then I met up with Kris, and we started working on a new idea. And while we were working on that, we kind of came up with the idea for Competitious, which was a separate thing, and we felt the need for it, and the rest is history.
All right, so I'm Kris Rasmussen. I started out consulting at a pretty young age, working on some of the early hotel reservation networks. And back then, it didn't require much technology to make money, so it was mainly search engine optimization and things like that. In high school, I got interested in 3D graphics, and I wrote a full implementation of Quake 3 in Java in software, and as well as a procedural level detail terrain engine and all the tools that go with any game framework. I got my degree in computer science with technical minor in mathematics from UCLA. And I graduated early and started doing consulting and design work. And then I got picked up by Microsoft, and I worked on the SharePoint platform, developing blogs, wikis, doing security reviews for client scripting issues, and improving the UI and the general extensibility of the platform, or the features, as Microsoft likes to call it. I've always been kind of an entrepreneur, so I wasn't too happy there and didn't stay long. And while I was there, I had permission to work on my own company, which was called Personal Trainer Pages. So I left last year, about a year and a half ago, and launched Personal Trainer Pages, which I built on top of a scalable drag-and-drop AJAX website building platform. And it was pretty advanced for its time. I built it about 2 years ago, and it's still pretty cutting edge, but only personal trainers get to see it, so it's kind of sad. Then I went up with Andrew, and we started Competitious.
All right, so how many of you have had a chance to use Competitious? A few people. All right, so we'll go through a quick tour of it since most people haven't seen it. Competitious is an online service that helps companies discover, organize, and analyze information about their competitors. We launched an initial beta in October of 2006. We got the TechCrunch post the same day. It's still very much in beta. We've been developing it since. We're working on some more advanced features. We'll show you our beta today and walk you through it. But our plan is to change the way companies consume and act on competitive knowledge. So if you're a startup, a brand new startup, you're considering working on a new idea, or you're in an established organization, if you want to get market share, you have to know who your competitors are, and you have to stay competitive. For us, I used to sort of avoid this when I was working on a new idea. I didn't actually want to find that there were people who had thought of it before. But even in Yahoo, we found that there were never really good standards for finding information, organizing it, and then getting value out of that on an ongoing basis and disseminating it to everyone that needed to get it easily.
An interesting thing is actually we came up with the idea because we wanted to make a service where companies could list who their competitors were and then see how many companies had similar competitors to gauge how interesting their idea was and unique it was. Because we found that some of our ideas weren't as unique as we thought.
So this is what we call the dashboard screen. If you use Competitious, we organize everything into projects. So a startup might only have one project, one idea you're working on. In a bigger company, you're going to have several different products, several different services, each of which may have disparate competitors. The dashboard is basically the place where you can quickly list who your competitors are. You can see the recent activity in the account. And then we have the recent clippings, and we'll show you what clippings are in a second. If you click on a competitor, you go to the competitor screen, and here we're pulling in things from several sources. We have Alexa giving you the screenshot and the traffic data, and we're working on other ways to get traffic. We know Alexa's not necessarily the best thing. And then we have Google News on the right for that competitor. And on the bottom, we've got notes down here. Basically, if you want to list anything about a competitor, you want to just talk about their pricing, you want to talk about a product and their features, this is the way you can do it. Again, this is very early. We've got a much better note system in the works. It's really going to improve on this. So on the right, like I said, you've got Google News. You can clip it directly there, and we'll go into clippings. Clippings are basically a social bookmarking service for news about companies that are competing with you and about your own company. It's very easy to create one. We have a bookmarklet, and we also allow you to create one manually. For us, we used to find news constantly about companies that competed with us. Using Delicious wasn't really an option because it's not secure. We needed it to be private. And so we used to email each other back and forth, and this is a really good solution for that. When you're creating a clipping, and this is editing, but it's the same thing, you can set sentiment about any company listed in the article, which is kind of an interesting thing. And going forward, there's a lot of cool things we can do with that, using NLP and try to do it automatically. But this lets you later go back. If you go to the previous screen, you can see that you can filter by sentiment, you can filter by competitors. So you can see quickly positive news about your company, negative news about a competitor, negative news about your own company, places you need to fix and work on. And then this is our comparison matrix. Kris, you want to?
Yeah, so our comparison matrix is probably one of the more advanced client-side things that we have. As you can see, right now we only allow checkmark values, but in our current versions that we have internally, we actually have all types of values you can add with different attributes and things like that. And then we're going to be doing analytics on top of that to produce scorecards and things like that. So we do a lot of pretty fancy JavaScript here, and we'll be talking about how we did some of that a little bit later. Rails makes it really easy to create powerful AJAX applications, but it also makes it easy to create non-performant AJAX applications. So we'll talk about how to avoid that. Okay, so I'm sure a lot of you guys are pretty experienced, but I'm just going to go over the general kind of thought process that people have when they're considering a new web technology and adopting it on their team. The first thing, if you're a small company, is I think development speed is incredibly important. It doesn't matter how big your project's going to be in the long run. If you're a new company just starting out, you're really going to be evolving your idea rapidly over time, and it's important to get to market early and be able to evolve to customer feedback quickly, because it's rare that a company gets it right the first time. The second thing is just the libraries and frameworks that are available. With Rails, which is the framework for Ruby pretty much, I think it's a great framework. I've had experience with tons of frameworks, and I really love the Rails framework and the way it kind of stays out of your way and provides just the right amount of stuff to get you going. Scalability is always a concern, and it's a big concern when people are considering Ruby. Obviously, Ruby being an interpreted language and kind of a not well, or I don't know, a new one, it's not going to have the kind of raw throughput that Java or C or something like that's going to have. But generally, when you're dealing with web applications, your bottlenecks are going to lie somewhere else. They're going to be like fetching third-party data from some other service or dealing with your database or things like that. So for the majority of applications, the scalability of Rails really isn't an issue. And in terms of scalability, I mean, Rails actually scales pretty elegantly and makes it a lot easier to do so than with other frameworks or languages. So I think as a startup, it's pretty safe betting on Rails and not worrying about scalability until that becomes an issue. Maintainability, on the other hand, is an issue. With Ruby as a language being dynamic and having Rails being a lot of code generation going on behind the scenes, it does make it harder to debug code, and it does make it harder to maintain code over time. But if you are a good developer and you follow the right design patterns, you can avoid most of those pitfalls, and you can typically work around it. So those are just some of the different maintainability issues. Okay, we personally chose Ruby on Rails because I had a huge experience with Java and tons of different frameworks in my own frameworks. And I personally got really tired of writing configuration and plumbing code, trying to tie things to the database and create my own components and all these things. Originally, I thought components were awesome. I thought being able to reuse my code everywhere was great, and the fact that I could use them with other clients. But the fact of the matter is, it rarely ever worked. When you start putting business logic into components, you start writing kind of application-specific code that really doesn't translate well to other applications. So it's better to try to only create simpler things for view logic and stuff like that. The other reason was there's no template languages. And template language is yet another thing you have to learn, and yet another thing you have to maintain and extend. And with Ruby, the syntax is so elegant that it works really well just embedding directly inside of the code or inside of HTML, and it looks a lot like a tag library with the procs that you can pass around, and the way that attributes don't always require, or hashes don't always require curly brackets. We also believe in iterative development and rapid prototyping, and Rails makes it a lot easier to do that because the turnaround time from when you're coding to when you're viewing the application is pretty much instant on any decently performant machine. And then again, like I said, there's less emphasis on broad package components. Rails originally had components integrated into the framework, and now they're removing it. Most people really don't need to use them. It's a lot better to just kind of mix and match partials and helpers and write minimal view logic rather than trying to embed business logic all over the place and trying to reuse that. Because it's especially since Rails is such a terse, elegant language, you can write business logic so concisely. And business logic typically changes and isn't often reused. And then I had a Java background, and he had a Java background from Stanford as well as PHP, and we were just more familiar with the type of syntax that Rails or Ruby uses versus Python. But we did consider adopting Python. We looked into some of the other frameworks like Dojo or the Django and TurboGears. And then finally, I've written a lot of JS libraries. I wrote some of the early JS libraries for AJAX about 2.5 years ago, before all these libraries are around. And so I have a lot of experience with JavaScript, and I really like the way that Prototype handles things, and it's kind of more of a lightweight library as opposed to Dojo. And Scriptaculous has some great effects, and it handles it very elegantly. And then the integration with Rails through RJS templates and things like that is amazing.
You guys hear okay back there, by the way? No? All right. I guess we
Let me turn this up. You guys hear me any better? Yeah. There we go. All right, so for us, it worked. We built the first version of Competitious in 3 weeks, and we launched it on a Wednesday, and by that night, we had a post on TechCrunch, and 3,000 companies signed up within a day or two. So it was pretty cool, and we had no scalability issues or anything like that. I mean, that's not that much traffic, so for the most part, most people don't have to deal with those kinds of things. So yeah, the partials and helpers worked out. Components, we didn't ever miss them. And we've been able to constantly evolve the service and respond rapidly to our customer feedback. And as a result, we've gotten a lot of press out of that. Just fixing simple issues, journalists feel proud that their recommendation got into our product so quickly, and they end up writing about it, which helps you a lot. But there were problems. Refactoring code is difficult. We were learning Rails at the same time we were using it, so we made some mistakes along the way. And you don't have the benefit of a nice integrated IDE with code refactoring where you can right-click and rename and have it just replace everything in your code. You have to be a little bit smarter about where you're using things, especially when you start getting into code generation at runtime. We ran into some problems with the fact that Rails is single-threaded. We didn't realize that initially. And then the fact that the processes tend to be pretty memory-heavy, so you can't run too many on a server, and that became our first bottleneck. And it needed a little bit more work than we expected to get into production mode. They make it sound like everything's kind of set and ready for you, but there's a lot of little quirks that you're going to run into along the way, so we'll talk about some of those. And then it doesn't support complex queries, which can be a performance issue. It really isn't for most applications, but when we start to get into more polymorphic relationships and things like that, and we want to pre or eager load data rather than lazy load data, it can be difficult with Rails occasionally, and sometimes active record, you can't even make it work as much as you try. But that should change over time. It's been getting better. even since we started. And then finally, it fetches all the data all the time, which means you need to be really careful about the way you architect your database, because it's difficult to specify exactly which attributes you want, especially if you're doing ear loading and including other models at the same time. So a lot of times it means just architecting your database a little bit differently and storing, creating a new table to store the bulk of the data for an object and keeping a separate table for the main data that's listed most often. And you can easily overquery your database just because it's so simple to construct queries with Rails.
I must have missed this, but can you say a little more about refactoring, why refactoring is difficult?
Because the
Repeat the question.
Yeah, so he asked why refactoring code is difficult with Ruby. And the reason is because there's so much code generation and things like that going on, and there aren't like IDEs that can. It's a like dynamic language, so the IDEs can't. You can't right click, and it's IDE support mainly, but also the nature of Ruby makes it really hard to develop good IDE support. So this is kind of our production checklist, just some simple recommendations. I would highly encourage anyone who plans on deploying a Rails app in production to get SVN set up right away before you start development. And then when you're ready to deploy, get Capistrano integrated. Capistrano is a deployment utility that enables you to basically manage your entire server from your development machines. So you can configure it to migrate your databases, to deploy your application, to roll back your application, and things like that. And then we use Mongrel as our kind of like our application container. And we get a little bit more performance and reliability out of that than fast CGI. Second bit of advice is that Rails logs all of your requests in the production logs, so it's important to filter out any sensitive data. Otherwise, you're going to have some logs floating around with a lot of interesting information like credit card numbers or passwords. And then obviously, Rails stores sessions on the file system by default, so you want to move that over to like an active record store, or even better, stored in memcached, using memcached. I don't know how many of you guys are web engineers over here have experience, but one of the most important things when developing a scalable application is keeping your database round trips to a minimum. It's usually not too hard to do, and it's important to look at your logs and look at the queries that are going on and pay attention to how often you're using the database. And then cache things when you're using it too much if you can't figure out another way around it. Important thing is ensuring that your web server serves static files. Like I said, Ruby is a little bit slower, and as a result, it's slower at serving static files. Also, you're not going to have that many Rails processes that you're going to be able to fit on one machine. And when someone comes to your site, they're going to request a lot of images. And it's pretty easy to screw up your Apache config and not have it store files. So test that and make sure you get that right. And then security reviews is pretty standard, but Rails, it's so easy to do all this cool JavaScript stuff, but it's also very easy to forget to encode some user editable content and introduce a cross-site scripting attack. It's a little harder to introduce SQL injection, but still possible. And then also because Rails has single attribute primary keys, you can run into security issues with that if you don't preload your data before updating it and make sure the user has permissions to access it. And I said don't rely on with scope, because with scope doesn't always work when you're loading, including other associations. But we actually modified Rails to make that work. All right, so I'm going to start to give you guys a glimpse into Competitious and our architecture. I'm going to cover a few specific things. I don't think actually our overall architecture is that interesting, but some of the specific problems we solved is. We're not fully RESTful yet, so I would encourage anyone developing a Rails application to read up on RESTful design. I've been using it with a lot of clients lately, and it really helps you simplify your architecture and make your code more maintainable. And we're going to be doing more of that with Competitious in the future. We have lots of many-to-many relationships, which enables us to distribute competitive information throughout the application and make it accessible everywhere. And we use the AJAX as everything design kind of paradigm or whatever, and we find it to be very useful and very powerful. So we have an AJAX as notable, which allows us to attach notes to any object with like a single line of code. AJAX as loggable, which I'll be talking about later, provides pretty flexible and powerful logging support to any Rails model. AJAX is securable, enables us to do things like email validation easily, and then AJAX is taggable is pretty standard, and AJAX is mediable allows us to attach media and things like that, but we don't have that in our current release. It's in our development version. So we have 19 controllers and 18 models. All right. So the biggest performance issue we've encountered is waiting on other services. If you're doing any sort of mashup or something like that, and you're loading data on your servers and not on the client, then this is something you should consider paying attention to. This is a problem because, like I said, Rails is currently single-threaded, I believe. It's still single-threaded, someone correct me. But as a result, you're going to use up a lot of memory for each request because you're going to have one process servicing every request, and a typical Rails process ranges from 17 to 70 megabytes. And ours are actually running around 70 because we're using RMagic and other libraries. And you can't count on third parties to always respond quickly. So the first step to mitigate this issue is obviously caching. And this will reduce the number of times you have to wait. We implemented a simple thing called an object cache. It's probably about 20 lines of code. And the way it works is we pass in a key, the amount of time we want to cache, and then a block. And the block can do anything we want it to do. In this case, it's probably requesting third-party data. If the data in the cache is expired or is not available, then the block gets executed. And if it is available, then we return it. And we can easily move the cache from the database to memcached or whatever we want. And I think actually Rails may have some built-in stuff to do this kind of simple caching as well, but it was so easy to write we didn't bother looking for it. So this will reduce the average wait time, but we're still going to have the worst wait time. And in our case, that's forever with Alexa going down pretty often. And not all terms of services are going to allow you to cache their data. So the next step to mitigating this that we tried out was pretty easy to get going, and that's just using timeouts. So in this case, I'm showing how you can use a timeout when you're getting some data from another web service. And the way it works is you pass in the number of seconds you want to wait for, or the maximum number of seconds you want the request to take. And if that time is exceeded, then it will throw an exception, and you can catch that exception in your caching code and return either out-of-date content or no content as a result. But the problem is you're still going to have to wait, and even 3 seconds can be a long time if you have a heavily used application and you only have 10 processes serving it. So some users are eventually going to get blocked. So the final step is asynchronous polling. The way this works is you start up a new process or thread to communicate with the third-party service at the beginning of every request. And ideally, this new process or thread is going to use a lot less memory than a standard Rails process. So it doesn't really matter if it has to wait around on the server for a while. And one way you can do this is using background DRB, which is for Ruby, or you could actually integrate with another service like something in Java or something like that. If by the end of the request the data is available, then you can return the data as normal. But if it's not available, then you can use AJAX to continually poll the server. And the goal, again, is if you're polling the server, you want your Rails process to return right away if the data is not available. And that's why you use polling. And if it is available, then you return it. And this will reduce the number of Rails processes blocked on third-party services, and therefore increase the number available to service new requests. I mentioned earlier that Rails makes it really easy to write great JavaScript, and you don't even have to actually know JavaScript most of the time or even be familiar with the libraries when you're using RJS templates. And that's good because it enables you to code in the same language all the time and use the technologies you're already familiar with. In this case, it may be like a Rails RHTML template or something like that, and you don't really have to get around and muck around with the document object model and cross-browser issues. But the problem is if you want to use Rails for all these things, then you're going to need to hit the server a lot in order to get the new data when you could be doing a lot of the work on the client otherwise. So the way we worked around this in order to continue using our same view logic is we created these things called JavaScript templates. This is pretty basic stuff. So what we do is we have this helper method called define.js template. We pass in the name of the template, and then we wrap a section of code or a template with this tag, or in this case, it's actually a method. And then we have these, as in red, you can see a syntax for having variable substitution on the client side. And then when we're on the client in JavaScript, we just call a single function called render.js template, the name of the template, and we pass any substitutions we want to make in the template. Now, the cool thing about this is that the define.js template function actually renders a text area around that section of the template so that any code that's in that template doesn't actually get executed until we want it to be executed with the variable substitutions in place. And this enables us to hit the server less for things like in-place editing on our comparison matrix. When you click on a field, there's every field needs a form to edit it. And we don't have to render that form ahead of time or hit the server in order to get that form for that specific field because we already have the data in the comparison matrix available. We just have to stick it inside of a form. So we render the template ahead of time, and then we use the variable substitution and create a DOM object out of it and render that to the client page without ever hitting the server. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about activity logging. Activity logging is pretty common with any application, and if you're not doing it, you probably should unless it's a big performance issue. There's a lot of problems associated with activity logging that are pretty common, and a lot of people encounter them. The first one is that records can be created, updated, and destroyed in multiple places, and it's just kind of a pain to always worry about writing logging statements in those places. And and a lot of times the logging statements are specific to whatever it is, the type of object you're logging, and so it can be tricky and painful to do that. And a lot of times you just won't do it because it becomes such a pain. The other problem is that each different record has different data that should be associated in the log, and you need a uniform way to capture that data and display it. And then finally, after records are updated and deleted, it can make log objects go stale and out of date. So if there's something like you have a log object that says so-and-so added a new picture, and that log statement has a link to view the picture, and then someone later deletes that picture, you want to have a way of elegantly removing that link and still maintaining your performance. So this is an example of an activity log that I built recently and that we'll be integrating into Competitious soon. But here you can see it's a pretty powerful activity log. It displays the type of content that was updated, the action, and you can see it's not just simply added, updated, or destroyed. There's also published and other actions. And then there's a log-specific string rendered, and that's rendered depending on the type of object which is being logged, and it links to the object that was edited. And in the case of the second entry there, you can see Mykonos was removed, so it actually removes the link, and anywhere else in the log back in time, that link is also removed. So the way we do this is with the Axis loggable plugin we created. It's a simple to use. On your model, you define Axis loggable, and then the type of data, the attributes on the model that you want to capture every time you're logging it. And it actually allows you to provide like a hash of parameters, and you can actually access the related models as well. And then in your controller, you can easily set up logging by wrapping whatever code is doing the logging in this, whatever the model name is, .with logging. And then you can pass in some state as well, because a lot of times when you're logging, you need to like record the user that did it or the project they're working in and things like that. And the really great thing about this is you can actually put that into an around filter in your application controller and have it work throughout your application, so you never have to worry about it again. So it's pretty neat. And then we have a system for creating views so that you can access that data that you captured for each object and render it specifically for that object. So it makes it really easy. So the way we design this is we have this class. I'm first going to talk about actually the bottom one, a log object. The log object is created for every other object that you're logging. So if you have an object like a person, every time a person gets its first log entry recorded, we create a log object for that, and we store the data that we want to capture about that object in the log object. And I'll talk about why we do this later. Then log objects themselves then have log entries, and log entries are the entries for every action that happens to the object which is associated with the log object. And here's a little diagram. The advantage of doing it this way is that every time an action happens to your loggable record, you're actually updating the data or serializing the data into the log object in the database. And that way, when the actual loggable record gets deleted, you still have reference to what the last state of the object was in your log object, and your log object doesn't take up as much room, so you can keep them around for a lot longer. And then finally, also, all your log entries are referencing your log object such that anytime your loggable record updates the state of the log object, the log entries get updated as well, so your log goes back in time and stays accurate if like a name of an object changes or something like that. And then we support like more advanced usage. In this case, I'm showing how you can use the, this is pretty common to Rails, like when you're including models, when you're trying to get a lot of data and you want to include other models, we use like the same syntax here. So in this case, we're using Axis loggable. We're including the name of the object. In this case, the type. This is for media. The ID of the media. And then over here, we're saying also get the media and include the name of that. So it'll actually evaluate all of that. And then we can also do things like media.with logging and specify an action. So instead of just saying that this object was updated, we actually want to signify that it was published. And so this will allow us to do that. And then we also allow you to pass in other data as well in case the data that you want isn't available on the object you're actually logging. So I'm going to post the code, the source code to this plugin on our blog, and I'll probably put up a project on Ruby Forge so people can use it. I'd encourage you to check it out and contribute to it and tell me what I did wrong or anything like that, or tell me how you like it. And that's about it.
You can also post the presentation. I noticed some of you were taking shots of this thing, so we can post the slides up on our blog as well. Just want to make life easier.
We're happy to talk and answer any questions anyone might have. We'd love to get feedback on our application, and we're also interested in potentially hiring people in the future. And we get a lot of resumes sent our way right now, and we can't really work. So if anyone's interested and anyone's looking for freelance work or full-time work, please feel free to give us an email, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Question? Yeah.
How many servers did you start?
Just one, actually.
Will you repeat
Yeah.
each question since your mic is going into the camera?
Yeah, of course. So he asked, what was your first question?
How many servers you started?
Okay, so how many servers we started with? We started with just one, and we were able to handle all the load from, or all the press from TechCrunch, VentureBeat, Mashable, and all these other blogs without any problem.
That's with Mongo?
That's with Mongo, and we actually only run, we started off with about 5 Mongo processes running, and then because of some issues with Alexa, we bumped that up to 10. Now we could probably get by with less, but typically our requests get serviced pretty quickly. And we're running MySQL. Oh, sorry, the question was what database we're running, and we run MySQL, in case you guys didn't know that was a database.
Did you guys do your development on the Mac?
We actually develop on Windows. I used to work at Microsoft. A lot of people at Microsoft do develop on Mac, to be honest, but I'm familiar with Windows, so I like Mac too, though. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Once you start on Ruby, if you want to change another, is it very, very difficult? Are you married to Ruby?
If you want to switch to another language or environment later on? Well, your database architecture is typically going to translate directly over because Ruby or Rails encourages a pretty good architecture, a pretty good database design, so that'll be fine. So actually, you won't have to have many issues with migrating data. But in terms of redesign your application, I mean, Rails does follow a pretty standard model view controller architecture and design. So there's a lot of other frameworks and other languages that also follow that design. But I mean, if you're switching languages, you're switching languages. So you're going to be rewriting most of your code. And also, Ruby does have some powerful language features like passing around procs and kind of cool syntax and things like that. And a lot of those things don't directly translate into other languages as well. So that you can run into some issues there.
My money to train my people, pay them to learn this to start off.
Hey, Andy, could you hand the mic?
Oh, sure.
I'm saying, is it worth the company's money? If I pay my people, my engineers to learn this, pay them to learn it and start off with Ruby, or is it?
Well, I mean, it depends on what you're developing. If you're trying to develop like a huge platform that millions of other developers are going to build off of or something like that, then Ruby might not be the right choice. But if you're trying to solve like a domain-specific problem, then Ruby's a great choice, and it's definitely worth your money. And I think most developers can pick up Ruby pretty quickly.
Can this thing scale like YouTube or Facebook? Or?
Theoretically, yes, but the issue is that your like raw performance per server, because Ruby is interpreted slower than some other languages, and the way it's implemented will just run slower. So theoretically, you would need a lot more servers to have the same scale. But the actual architecture of Rails is a very easy architecture to scale. Like you can easily spread out your databases, set up replication. You can add more application servers. Because you're using processes and not threading, that also makes it easier to start adding new servers because you're not dependent upon thread-specific state.
So you're saying depends on what site you're building, it would depends on what languages?
Yeah, I mean, if you think you're going to become YouTube, I would consider some other things potentially. But if you don't think you're going to be YouTube or you think you're somewhere in between, Ruby's probably a pretty safe choice.
Did you look at other frameworks, for instance, like Spring?
Yeah,
before
actually,
you get all this, because Spring is really unique and very powerful.
So
it's got a lot
was
of neat features. So yeah.
Yeah, I was a big Java guy before this, and I used HiveMind, which is similar to Spring, and I used Tapestry as well. Spring is a very broad framework used for a lot of different things, not just web, and a lot of web technologies integrate Spring into it. The issue with Spring that I have is there's still a lot of extra configuration code that a lot of extra stuff you're using to plug services together and things like that. And it's necessary because Java is not as dynamic, and there's not as much flexibility in Java as there is Ruby. But with Ruby, you actually get a lot of that stuff built into the language, using things like modules and mix-ins and stuff like that. So it's not as necessary.
And what would you not, what type of things would you not use Ruby on Rails for?
I wouldn't use Ruby on, I would think before I use Ruby on Rails if there was a very large development team that I was managing and I thought I was going to write a lot of code over a period of like 8 years, and a lot of people were going to build off of that code, because Ruby is not, it's not the best language to write APIs in, because the code access security isn't really there, which means you can't really restrict what people do with the libraries you write. So if you were Microsoft developing some API and your developers had a lot of like internal methods that they used internally, but they didn't really test that well, and they only wanted to be used internally, you wouldn't really be able to protect other users from starting to get at that with Ruby. Things like that become issues. And then also, like I said, refactoring code in Ruby can be a little more difficult because it's generating a lot of code at runtime, and that can make large-scale development efforts a little more difficult. Your engineer quality has to go up a little bit, and you have to write a lot more tests. But otherwise, I mean, for any small specific problem or even bigger problems, it's definitely worth considering. You just got to kind of weigh the pros and cons and things like that.
I'm curious about your business model.
Oh, sorry. I'll let you go. Let him go first because you got the mic.
I'm curious about the business model. Are you subscription-based? Is that?
So we're going to start having premium subscriptions soon, but we're going to keep the pricing really low. Our competitors are up in like the $20,000 a year range, and we don't plan on getting anywhere near that. Our end business model is a little more interesting, but we can't really get into that right now. So starting with subscriptions, though. So traffic, anytime we get a press push, we'll get around like 1,000 to 2,000 visits a day. With TechCrunch, we got around 50,000 visits. And then on normal days, we have a couple hundred users logging in.
How's your RESTful architecture going?
Well, I'm using RESTful architecture in some side projects all the time. Our application does have RESTful architecture, or Competitious does. We just didn't write it when RESTful support was baked into Rails. So we're not really prioritizing it, but we're just using it as we build new components and things like that.
Did you run into any issues?
There's certainly issues when you try to like force a RESTful architecture on your entire application, but that's not, I mean, you just, if it becomes too much of a pain, you just don't do it. And that's the only issue we really ran into.
What kind of debugging and testing tools have you been using?
We actually, yeah, he asked what kind of debugging and testing tools we've been using. We don't actually use any fancy debuggers. I'm not really a proponent for stepping through code, unless you're like jumping into a huge code base with millions of lines and you really just don't know what's going on. We actually just use the breakpoint method in Rails and Ruby script breakpointer, and then we just look from there. And then in terms of testing, we just write unit tests and things like that, all the stuff that's baked into Rails. Other question?
You can see the execution of your code in Rails. So in one session, it's actually very straightforward.
Yeah.
It dumps everything that is done there, and then you have to sort through it and try.
Okay. Yeah.
Should I take the mic? Or?
Yeah, take the mic because I think we're on video here.
I'll do a talk. Some people were talking about it a little bit, but so I'll have a company funded next week, and I am a reasonably experienced programmer myself, but it took me a while to get decent at Rails. And so all the people I'm likely to hire are people who already know Java framework, and if the mandate's to go fast and build something in 4 months, I'm concerned that I'll be hiring a bunch of people. There's very few people you can hire with Rails experience now, so I'll be hiring these Java programmers.
So
how long does it take, right? Like to get really good at it.
So I switched from Java to Rails in a month, and I built like Competitious and 2 other projects at the same time. So I picked it up pretty quick. I think what you'll find is most really good engineers have already learned Ruby. So if you want to hire quality engineers, they're probably going to have no trouble learning Ruby. If you just want to hire cheap engineers, I mean, that's another issue. It does take a while to learn. I mean, there are some. It's a very implicit language, or the framework actually is very implicit. So it kind of takes a little while, like a month, kind of getting comfortable with it and learning how to browse through the documentation and sometimes even look into the source to get answers to your problems. But once you kind of figure out what the basic design philosophy is of the people who created it, it becomes very, very powerful, and you end up writing a lot less code.
So I sometimes get kind of incomprehensible error messages that are deep in the framework code. Does that still happen to you guys? Or?
I think you become kind of accustomed to what those error messages mean pretty quickly, and it is true that you will run into some things like that. But honestly, if I get an error message, I can probably figure it out within like 2 minutes. So, and I haven't been using it for more than 6 months, 7 months maybe.
Super.
With your background in Java, did you guys ever look at Groovy and Grails, which are probably
Yeah, actually, well, so Groovy, does that have anything to do with Tapestry?
No, it's like
It's language, but I think they
language.
added support for it in Tapestry. No, I didn't look into Groovy too much. I've seen it, but I'm not too familiar with it. What was the other one?
Grails, so the Rails clone.
Okay, yeah, so I didn't get to that because I probably picked up Rails before that had...
And then a second part to the question, do you find the power in the Ruby on Rails stuff? Is it sort of the community and the way they think and build their tools, or is it the language itself that sort of provides the power?
I think it's a combination of both. That's probably the easy answer. But no, honestly, I think Ruby, the language itself, is just very elegant, and the way you can use closures and pass around procs so simply and so elegantly, and the way it looks so much like what other languages have to create components for and things like that, encourages like the type of design that I think a lot of like experienced web engineers really like, and it does it with less code. And as a result, I think you combine that with really smart people working on it, and it all kind of works out. Let's wait till we get the mic here. So.
Just both Java and Ruby basically duplicated the maturity of Smalltalk. So if you knew Smalltalk before, you'd find Ruby really extremely easy.
Yeah, so unfortunately I didn't use Smalltalk before, but I've heard great things about Smalltalk, and that's probably a very good observation.
You've mentioned components in Java versus Ruby a couple of times. Are you talking about like dependency injection sort of
No,
things, or what?
I'm not really talking about dependency. Actually, so that's another issue. You don't really need dependency injection and things like that with Ruby, as we were talking about earlier. But when I was saying components, I was referring more to component-oriented frameworks like Tapestry, server faces, and then like .NET and things like that are going towards component-oriented design, which I was a big proponent of for a long time.
I just referred to about threading and processing. So can you explain more like this? Is there no threading in Ruby? Or?
No, Ruby supports threading, but Rails was designed to be single-threaded. So I think there's like lots of hooks in the code now where they're trying to work around that. But in general, it's a little bit easier to scale a single process architecture. But I mean, it's easier, not necessarily better. So I think that with time, it should become multi-threaded.
So it doesn't have a concept of execute threads and things like that. Just like in WebLogic, you have execute threads and worker threads that you...
No, you can create threads, but the actual framework itself is using like, I don't know, it's not using thread-safe like variables and things like that, so it wouldn't work when it was multi-threaded. And a lot of the plugins don't either.
Is the language using hardware threads yet, or is it still?
I actually don't think the language... Yeah, it's still green threads.
So using Ruby threads wouldn't give you any more performance.
Well, it wouldn't give you more performance, but you would share the memory that Ruby is loading. So that's the big pitfall of for threading that I find. Got any other questions?
Yes, do you have any idea of the difference in productivity from, say, using Java, Spring, all that stuff?
Yeah, so he asked if I had any idea about the difference in productivity from Java and Spring and all those things. I found that my productivity probably went up 100-fold, and that's not joking. I was like a very good Java developer. The vertical content management framework that I wrote, it took me about a year. I was working at Microsoft at the time, but I was working pretty hard. It took me about a year. I probably could rewrite it now in Rails in 20 days. So, I mean, that's maybe, it's not quite a, 10x, but you know, there's other things. When you're using JavaScript and all that stuff, my productivity shoots through the roof. So, other questions?
Are you considering a web API
Are we considering web API? Yes, we are. So we will have ways of inserting clippings and things like that into our application via a API and other things like that. Also integrating with Salesforce. Any other questions?
I have a question now. I can go on Google and I can look up I can go on Google and spend a morning and look up my competition, let's say the 5 major companies that I'm competing with. So, and I can get a lot of information just doing my own searching using Google. So what exactly are you providing that I can't do in a morning? I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, that's a good question.
You know, what exactly am I getting from you guys that I can't get just Googling myself with a day or two, you know, set aside to do that?
Right, so I'll let Andrew answer this question.
Well, the first, if you're just by yourself, I mean, obviously the platform's collaborative. That was one big aspect. But we're not so much focusing on the news yet as much as the ability to ongoing have data about your competitors that you can pull meaning from. So if you find a company is doing something, the platform will allow you to start sort of describing what they're doing. So maybe someone announced a new thing and there was an acquisition. Ongoing, you can use a comparison matrix to describe what they're doing, and then we can basically use that data to, in a quantitative fashion, pull out reports and help you segment your competitors. So you can say, based on what someone is doing, this is a direct competitor, and we can use self-organizing maps to kind of figure that out. And you can segment, so these are direct, these are sort of tangential, this one poses the biggest threat. And then ongoing, just kind of figure out, are there any opportunities I should be going after, and things of that nature.
I think right now, the advantage we have, because he's talking about a lot of things we're going to be doing in the future, and there's actually some really interesting things we're going to be doing in the future. But right now, the advantage is that, for one, if you have like queries, like a lot of times Google's going to return a lot of junk when you search for a straight competitor name. We allow you to modify that query and then store it so that everyone on your team has access to it. So you have this one place where you go every day to check up on your news. And right now, it's a little painful because you have to click on each competitor, but in the future, we'll have like an aggregated dashboard of all your news. Also, we pull like a lot of data in at once that you wouldn't otherwise look at every day. So it makes it easier to do things that are usually painful. And then we also enable you to clip that information and share it and talk about it with other people and build a comparison matrix that looks better than most Excel matrices do. So that's what we have right now. But our long-term goals are actually much different from what you can see on the site.
Yeah, I'd say just one more thing. Our goal with this is to make it accessible, and we mean that in a number of ways from a pricing standpoint. But basically, if you've never really done an actual analysis of competitors and broken down this kind of threats and opportunities and done what sometimes is called a SWOT analysis, so that's the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of your competitors. It's really going to help you provide some best practices for doing these things, so helping you structure your thoughts. We used to do the same thing. We used to go to Google. We used to look at news. For someone like us, we've got competitors that are in the enterprise. We've probably got close to 30 competitors. If we include everyone that's tangential, like JotSpot might be one competitor. Now, they're not direct. We still want to monitor them and watch the stuff they're coming out with and make sure that we're really targeting the right thing. And then, obviously, in an organization where you've got more than just one individual, the collaborative aspect is big. So disseminating information, pulling out reports, things like that.
JotSpot's Google.
Yeah, JotSpot's Google.
That's where you are now. Your competitors are.
Yep.
We're trying to solve a specific problem, though, and make an application that's highly tailored for that. JotSpot's a little broader, so it's harder for people to pick up for a specific purpose.
Thanks. So you guys spent a little time talking about some of the drawbacks and certain, I guess, cases or types of applications where you would think twice. I was wondering if you could talk about, having been in the Ruby on Rails community, how you think some of those things may or may not get resolved over time. Where's the community development going, and are these things going to be addressed soon? And I ask that sort of from the perspective of, there's probably a lot of people in the audience that sort of are wondering, should we do this? Should we invest? Should we train our people, et cetera? And if you can kind of look into the crystal ball a little bit, having sort of actually really invested in yourself, and tell us where you think it's going, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of talk about a JIT, a just-in-time compiler for Ruby, being developed, and that's supposed to be released. I'm actually not as involved in the community as I should be because I'm working most of the time. But last I heard, it was going to be released sometime this year, towards the end of this year. Some people are working on it. There's also integration with running Ruby directly in Java and even compiling to Java bytecode, which would be awesome, I think. So that's being worked on. In terms of like issues with active record, like I said, there's like some sort of relationships and data queries that you can't really represent right now with active record. A lot of those things are being fixed. Like I fixed some of them myself in our own code base. I mean, everything's pretty well architected, so it's, if you want to get in there and do it, you can. Yeah, so I mean, in the last 6 months alone, we've seen tons of issues solved that we had to solve ourselves when we first launched Competitious. And so things are going very, very quickly. So I would say that the majority of the problems that I addressed with the framework itself will probably work themselves out within a year. And then in terms of the performance of Ruby, that should be worked out in the next year or two. Oh, sorry.
Two questions. The first one, I just wanted to make sure I understood the point of Competitious, right? So what I'm doing when I use Competitious is I'm setting filters to trap information about my competitors. I'm not actually using it to view information that the competitors post about themselves.
You can actually, you can do both actually, but so we pull in like the competitor blog posts as well on the competitor dashboards. So that's information they post about themselves. But we also then, you know, make it easy to set up, or we actually automatically set up queries into Google Blog Search and Alexa to get traffic information and news about them. And right now, like the way we're discovering information is actually very limited, and we're totally willing to admit that. We don't discover that much information for you, but we do more than what other services do, and we do it in one place, and we do use it ourselves every day. We're very reliant upon it, and we enable you to organize that and talk about it easier. So in the future, we're going to do much better discovery of information and much better analysis of that information, which includes things like natural language processing to filter out news that isn't relevant to your company and helping to find related competitors and things like that. Oh, and I don't know if he was talking about this, but we don't share data between accounts, if that was what you were saying. So if your competitor is on our service, we don't like let you see their information or recommend competitors.
Can I pay you extra?
Yeah. So we want to make that clear. So we don't plan to do that either. So you can feel safe.
Okay. So the second question then was, let's say in a year your demand is huge. You know, you are YouTube. Do you chuck Ruby on Rails and rewrite in something else?
Well, hopefully in a year, the performance of Ruby will not be an issue. So. I mean, it takes a long time to develop an application in Java. If you can get out the door 100 times quicker developing a Ruby application, and then you just have to invest in more hardware, that's usually worth the cost. So.
Just to address the issue about Ruby's performance, the VM is called Yarv. It's being written by Koichi Sasada. It has been merged into the 1.9 tree, so you can check it out. It runs almost all the tests. The early benchmarks show it's about 5 times as fast as the existing Ruby 1.8. It'll be part of Ruby 1.9, which will be released Christmas Day this year. And Matt's never misses his deadline. So, you know, everybody says Christmas Day, and you think, yeah, June. It'll be released December 25th of this year, public.
That's good to know. Thank you. Or I'll repeat your question if you want to yell it out.
My question is, aren't you worried that the lack of static information in the programs will become an issue, say in a year, if you have to compute a code base to someone else?
The lack of static
typing information.
Typing. Oh, you mean as a maintainability issue? No, actually, I was worried about that when I made the switch from Java.
What's the question again?
The question is whether or not the lack of static typing in Ruby as a language will become an issue as the code base evolves and grows. And my answer to that is that I don't find that the static typing has ever been an issue for me. I mean, when you're doing web programming, you're typically dealing with requests which are always strings anyways, so you really don't have much typing to begin with web engineering. And also, I mean, to the fact that Ruby, like once you assign a value to an object, it has to maintain that type, and it checks that from then on out. That is, I think, enough, and in my experience, that is all you really need. So that's my experience. But I mean, it also depends, I think, on the quality of your engineers and things like that, because you can't do as much analysis. So.
Pass the mic over? Sure.
If you go into the Google Web Toolkit GWT website, they have why they use Java to develop it, and they convert into JavaScript, and they talk about duck typing and things like that. And people get used to the code complete of dot, and you get all the properties and methods and all. But now, if you are starting new, and code complete will really help you because you don't need to search for the API, look for the exact method, signatures, and things like that. But Ruby doesn't provide you that, right?
I think there are people working on that. There's a couple of projects, I think, funded recently, developing things like that. I think Google might have funded one of them, or just on their little summer code thing. But yeah, that's true. Definitely when you're learning a language, it does help to have code completion, and in the long run, it also helps to have code completion. But you sort of kind of like with Ruby and with Rails, you sort of learn to expect the way things should work, and it's really good at like following that all the way through. So once you kind of learn what to expect, you end up not having to rely upon code completion, and you probably end up becoming a better coder. Most of the people I worked with at Microsoft use like Emacs and things like that without code completion at all the great coders. So for the most part, you should really like understand your framework and your language and your APIs, and not be looking things up too often. And if you do need to look them up, I mean, it's really not that hard to Alt-Tab over to your documentation and Control-F and search for something that you need. So yeah, it is an issue though.
Let's just take one more question since we're a little over.
One more question.
Or zero.
Or zero is good too. All right.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'll use that, I guess. Thanks a lot to Andrew and Kris for coming and telling us about their company. It looks like this is by far the best turnout we've had so far. And so I guess this sort of event is of interest to the community. I want to thank everybody for coming tonight, and also I guess we ran out of these because we had so many people come tonight. So I'm going to read off some of the information about the conference. So it's April 21st and April 22nd, the weekend. And so the first one, this is the second annual Silicon Valley Ruby Conference. The one we had last year, I went to that, and it's the genesis of this SIG. So we started the SIG out of that conference. And it's a lot of fun. It's like I envisioned that it must have been what the old Homebrew Computer Club was like. There was a bunch of people sitting in the room, actually mostly guys, kind of like this room. And there's like 200 guys and like 5 women that are sitting there talking about computers and figuring out ways to make computers do special things. And in this case, all about Ruby. It was a lot of fun. It was a great time. I encourage everybody to go. I know some people in this room went. So please do consider it. The location is still TBA, which is a shame because I volunteered Google, and they didn't want to do it here. But maybe they're going to come back and ask to do it at Google because it says TBA on the announcement still. So we'll see. If you have any ideas for what you'd like to be presented at this conference, please email me. So if you think you might have an idea, get ready to write down my email address. It's GCOLADON, which is it's the Unix. That's my old Unix handle. gcoladon@gmail. So please shoot me an email. And if you have some topic that either came out of what we talked about tonight or anything you're interested in related to Ruby or Rails, please let me know, and I'll pass it on to the people that are organizing the conference. And are there any final questions or points about the conference tonight or anything else? Otherwise, I'll thank everyone for coming out tonight, and hopefully see you on April 21st. And if not, we'll see you at the next one of these, which is, we may move it to Wednesdays, but it would be in the beginning of May. So thanks again for coming out tonight. Good night.